Joe, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So at the beginning of your book, you say that the advertising industry has launched what you call one of history's most massive stealth efforts in social profiling. How is this happening, and what are the implications for consumers?
Well, a lot of it is happening because companies feel that they have to know a heck of a lot more about their consumers, the users of their products, than they ever had before. As a consequence, there are tens and tens of companies that are prepared to follow consumers wherever they go, trying to anyway, and then to share the data anonymously or not anonymously with publishers and marketers. And the consequence is the kind of new environment that we're seeing in the media and among advertisers.
Historically, if we look at the rise of the media agencies, what were some of the under-the-hood forces that led to this environment of digital intrusiveness?
Mainly it has to do with the transformation of the media buying industry. The media buying industry is really a subset of the advertising industry. Historically, media buying was a straightforward activity. The center of advertising was in creating the ads, and then the idea was, where do we go to put those ads? By time, by space, and it was pretty straightforward in a country like the United States, where you went to television, magazines, newspapers, maybe billboards. With the rise of cable television, you had the beginning of the multiplication of channels and the question of how do we try to reach people with different demographics across 150 type channels, plus other new media coming online. And then with the rise of the internet, that multiplied almost infinitely. And by then, a whole new set of companies, media planning and buying companies that had been spun off from the major advertising agency conglomerates as standalone profit centers had emerged. And those companies are leading the march into this new world.
So what are some examples of the kind of intrusiveness that you're talking about?
Well, the kind of intrusiveness I'm talking about has to do with, in the first instance, following people around the web, even around a site, for example. What is it that you do on a website? How does that relate to what we know about you demographically? And then beyond that, what is it that you do across a variety of websites? And then beyond that, what is it that you do connecting your laptop activities with your mobile activities, with your in-store activities? And all of that begins to create a profile of you. Much of it today is thin, though increasingly we're talking about hundreds of data points. A lot of it today is rather transient, so that if people get rid of their cookies, and a lot of people don't, but if people get rid of their cookies, they won't be able to be followed as well. But increasingly, we're in a situation where hundreds and hundreds of data points about people across a whole variety of aspects of their being, together with lots of ways to track them across sites and across platforms, is emerging. And down the line, it's already having implications for the ads we see, for the discounts we get, for the worldviews that we get in terms of marketing and advertising, but it's also beginning to affect what we see in news and entertainment. And it's having enormous ramifications for the so-called legacy media.
How so?
Well, what's happening is that the legacy media, and by that I mean traditional magazines, newspapers, particularly print media, are finding that as they lose audiences who are migrating to the web, and particularly in an economic downturn, advertisers are following them to the digital environment. What we see, however, is that advertisers are not sticking with those same platforms. They're moving into other platforms, and the competition is so large that while they used to get tens of dollars per thousand people in, say, newspapers and magazines, now we're talking about a couple of dollars and even less. And as a result, magazines and newspapers that used to make a lot of money on those individuals in the legacy world are having trouble surviving even with double or triple the number of audiences in the digital world.
Which are the companies you think are most responsible for some of these intrusive practices?
What we see are companies that have to do with tracking and managing data. Okay, some of the biggest companies like Acxiom and Experian have data about virtually everybody, at least in the United States. You could literally, if you go to the Axiom catalog, which you can find online, you can see that they sell enormous amounts of information about us, sometimes actual with names. So you can find out what kinds of health aspects people search for. You can find out what kind of houses people have, or what kind of financial activities they do, what kind of psychographic profiles they have, what vacations they take. Then there are companies like Exalate, 33Across, X+1 that are more niche companies in the digital realm. And what they do is they track people and create cookies about people, often anonymously, that can be merged with marketers' cookies about those same people. And if you put all of this together in a pot, and sometimes the data flow across these sorts of companies, many companies now are looking at social relationships, for example. So you add social relationships to demographics, to offline activities, to shopping activities, to lifestyle profiles. All of these things begin to create images of who we are, essentially reputations. And what I try to do in the book is to show that we're at the beginning of this era, certainly not even the middle and the end. But if you follow the industrial logic, you see how this has the implication, the possibility of really creating a situation where we live in these silos, these areas of life based on how marketers define us, without knowing anything about where they get this information and even that it's going on, except this vague notion that it's happening.
You use a term in the book, long click. What exactly is that, and what implications does it have?
The long click is sort of the holy grail of advertisers today. It's the idea that we can begin to follow a person from that top of the funnel, okay, the marketing funnel, which we could discuss whether that really exists or not in the way it's discussed. But at any rate, from the time a person begins to look for a product, through the various online and offline platforms that person uses, to the point where that person swipes a credit card, writes a check, and then we can try to attribute that person's activities through the entire process of searching and eventually purchasing. Knowing that, we know a lot more about what that person does, who that person is, and we maybe can generalize to other people we think are like that. So that's the kind of holy grail. It also justifies the monetization of certain media much better than it ever has been done before. As I say, it's a holy grail, but technologies are developing to try to do that.
What were some of the technological innovations that the advertising and media industry had to go through in order to, get the capability of doing some of the things you're describing?
The first one that we often take for granted in this ball game is the cookie. The cookie was created as a very conscious effort to try to help marketers and actually stores online to track people's purchases when they were buying more than one thing. The cookie people who created the cookie really had some philosophical issues. How do we think about privacy in this? And in the mid and late 90s, when all this was going on, they created a certain kind of regimen which was more beneficial, some would say, to marketers than to people who care about privacy. But the cookie's only the beginning. Together with the cookie, we had the development of probabilistic statistical thinkers, computer scientists, who have tried to figure out how we can get a hold of what it means to follow an individual across a whole variety of spaces. That's another deep technological sort of invention that has taken place. Another, of course, is search. And with the rise of Google, really we have a new marketing model having to do with the notion of the click, which is controversial. The click itself is a fascinating technology. It's really the extension of a human being's hand. And people say, well, do we really want that to be the model of what it means to sell a product? Because display advertising gets hit by that. So now there's a pushback in terms of display and an attempt to try to figure out ways to model engagement as it relates to display. So all of these ideas are taking place with a whole new group of people who are thinking about this. Some of them worked on Wall Street and worked on derivatives, and now they're moving into Madison Avenue, and they're trying to understand how to bring big data and how to bring new technologies to the question of how do we define people. It's totally understandable. My concern about it is that it's also totally under the hood, and we as a society really have no idea about what's going on, what control we have, and down the line what the implications are going to be.
Right. So let me just explore this a little bit further with a very specific example that I just remembered. The other day I was on Amazon.com and I bought a gift for a friend. It was a book on Buddhist meditation. And the next time I went to Facebook, suddenly I started seeing ads about the Dalai Lama's videotapes. Now, on the one hand, this could be an example of what you're just describing, the long click, where someone somewhere saw my behavior on one website, Amazon, and is now presenting commercial messages to me on Facebook.
Yes.
But could it also not be argued that this is something that might benefit me if I were genuinely interested in this topic?
No question.
So how do you resolve that in your book?
Well, the way I try to resolve it is the following. I'm not against target marketing. I'm not against following people online for reasons that you suggest. What I am against, if we want to call it against, is the issue of it happening without people understanding it and without their giving permission regarding it. Because then what happens in the end, I would argue, it hurts marketers and advertisers. Fundamentally, we're moving into a society where data about us are going to be continually traded in ways that have not happened at the scale before. That's what we started with, that question of collecting information about people. There's never been a time in history where individual bits of data about all of us are circulating the way they are. Now, if we accept the notion that we're just at the beginning of this, and that marketers' logic require, if you read the trade press and go to meetings as I do, the notion that we're going to try to follow people wherever they are and serve them what we consider to be relevant to them whenever they seem to want it. The question becomes, who gives you the right to define me and to surround me with ads and discounts and somebody else with very different ones? Some people are going to lose, other people are going to win. Some people are going to be called waste, which is a term that they use, and some people are going to be targets. And as a society, we have to come to grips with that, because eventually people are going to say, hey, you showed me a different map of the airplane for seats than you showed the guy next to me. As a consequence, I ended up having to pay $25 for an aisle seat, and you didn't. Why is this going on? And right now, people are relatively calm about this sort of thing. But eventually, we may have Occupy Madison Avenue the way people had Occupy Wall Street. People are going to get their hands on the idea that something is amiss here because we are being defined by forces we have no clue about.
Right. Now, you also argue in the book that some of these advertising models are destroying traditional publishing ethics.
Yes.
Can you give any examples of that?
Yeah, their magazines used to have, and newspapers too, this idea of the church-state divide. The term was coined by a famous American publisher, Henry Luce, who owned Time Incorporated. And the notion was that the business side should not even speak to the editorial side. With hyper-competition, particularly in the print area, and with the notion that somehow the web is fundamentally different and you have to make money there in advertising, not even subscriptions, though companies, as you know, are trying to get money that way. That has fallen apart. In much of the magazine industry, the notion now is how can we get advertisers to like us, and we'll bring them in any way we can, virtually. Now, there are some magazines that are more welcoming than others, but the notion of what a magazine is has fundamentally changed that way. For example, a major magazine company, Meredith, really sees itself as a marketing services company. And Hearst owns a digital advertising company. We're moving into a world where media are seeing themselves more as extension of marketers than they ever have. Not that they never did, but we had a period in American history where advertising and media editorial were considered separate. And even in newspapers, they're beginning to see parts of it, particularly soft news, as areas where they can welcome advertisers and not get into trouble with journalistic organizations.
That's very interesting. So if we believe that publishers are starting to customize news and information based on the characteristics that they think the advertisers want to see, what kind of privacy concerns do you think that raises?
Well, I think it has to do in that case with the question of why do I get certain agendas of news and you don't? So let's say hypothetically that I do an analysis of your clicking behavior and I find that when there are optimistic headlines that you look at, you're much more likely to put your mouse over an ad or maybe spend more time with an ad in a display manner than you would if we have pessimistic headlines. It's only a little leap for me to decide that from now on I'm going to change the headlines that you see, okay? And I could say, but that's what that person wants, see? And the same with television, which is going to move to an internet addressable system. There have been attempts at this for the last 10 years or so, but eventually customization of television will exist to the point that when you turn your TV on, you won't see a channel, you'll see an agenda, an intelligent navigator, as it may be called. And I can very easily see that the agenda that gets set up is a combination of what you say you want and what the algorithm said you're likely to like, together what some advertisers are interested in supporting. So maybe an advertiser will be likely to say, I will pay for this movie if you want to watch it this week. Your next door neighbor won't get that, okay? Or Tiffany might say, we know that your wife's birthday is coming up. Here's a romantic movie that we'll pay for you to watch. And they'll put product placements in there seamlessly specific to your demographic. And other people who see it will get very different product placements. So you will see a very different world writ large than other people will. And, it's not going to be totalistic, but in general, it could have very interesting effects on how you look at the world or reinforce your sense that you're being judged by society in certain ways and not in other ways. Fundamentally, it's a discriminatory activity. Some people gain by discrimination, other people don't. I also ought to point out that there are companies deeply involved in trending topics. And this, too, is affecting the media. So there's a company, for example, called Demand Media, which looks at what's trending, and Google and Bing has freelancers rather cheaply churn out videos and written stories on that with the idea of blanketing the web and their own websites so that when you do a search, their articles will come up. That has enormous implications for what we mean by journalism, soft news, and even eventually entertainment, and the kinds of things that advertisers want to put their stories next, their own stories, their advertisements next to.
I think these are all areas of major concern, especially the content farms, as these are called. And I think Google and some other companies have actually changed their algorithms to prevent this kind of thing happening.
They've tried. Ironically, you know what company that seems to have been hurt most? About.com, that was owned by the New York Times. That is owned by the New York Times. The Times was making a lot of money from that. They probably wouldn't call it a content farm, but they were really hit pretty hard as a consequence of it.
Right. Now, there's always been this view that the web empowers consumers. From the book, from what you say in the book, it seems like that might not be exactly true. Do you agree that? Do you think the web empowers consumers, or does it make them more subject to manipulation by companies and the government?
I think it's both. I think that in the most obvious way, the web empowers consumers. We can now walk into a store, look on our mobile device if you have a smartphone, and find out what prices are elsewhere. Stores have gotten to the point that they'll even allow people to go online in the store with the idea that if they don't keep them there to look at prices, they'll go anywhere else anyway. So those kinds of things, plus the ability to collaborate and to do a lot of things that some academics have emphasized, certainly show that the web is terrific, that the digital world is liberating in many ways. But what I was concerned in writing this book about is that people seem to stop there. And what I'm arguing is if you go under the hood of the internet and see where the core power really is, it has to do with trying to take back what advertisers, marketers were afraid they were losing with the advent of the digital world, really take back certain power. And we see developing into the 2000s and nowadays an attempt to use what people do that they consider liberating and turn it to the advantage of marketers in ways that people might not be at all comfortable with. And what we have found in a lot of the surveys we've done, people have this vague sense of discomfort, a vague sense that they know what's going on, but they really don't know much, for example, about data mining. They know stuff like that happens, but even if you go to websites that try to explain it, like Google, for example, they use one-point descriptions. So they'll say things like, how do we do this? Let's say we follow you across websites and find out that you're a football fan. Well, then we will send you ads about football. You know, that sounds so benign as to be stupid. Why would Professor Joe Turo care? Okay, but the point is they do a lot more than that, and we're talking hundreds of data points that are distributed across everything that you're looking at.
Right. So I wonder if we could end with some of the public policy implications. Mm-hmm. Do you think the solution lies in greater self-awareness and self-regulation by the advertising firms, or more interventionist action by the government?
I think all of the above. I think that advertising companies have to realize that there are real responsibilities in today's world. For a century, the advertising industry has basically gone on with the idea that it's a laissez-faire environment. Now it's quite clear that advertisers are shaping the media environment in ways that society will have major impact about, and also our understanding of ourselves. And for the self-protection of the industry, they have to understand self-regulation that has to be done seriously. And it depends. There should be a public discussion and an industry discussion, and there is to some extent, not deeply enough, I'd argue, about what that means. At the same time, I believe that regulation has to take place because there are a lot of bad actors out there, and there are a lot of competitive forces that companies like, for example, Google, who said 5 years ago they would never do something, are beginning to do it because now they're competing with Facebook and Twitter. And so in some ways, they should see public regulation and public discussion about these things as beneficial for the industry, because if things are done the right way, they will move forward in ways that people can feel comfortable with and that the public can feel safe about. And right now, I think both of those are highly problematic.
Great. Well, Joe, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.